So what we're going to start with is we have the first lecture of the nervous system. Now, when we look at the nervous system, there are several functions. The nervous system is going to function to detect changes in and outside of the body. It's going to integrate information from each of our senses, and it's going to coordinate muscles, organs, and glands with each other so that we can function properly. So we have two divisions of the nervous system. We have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, is the nervous tissue outside of the brain and spinal cord. So we have the afferent and efferent parts of the peripheral nervous system. Afferent transmits information from the senses toward the brain. Efferent transmits commands to the muscles or glands from the brain. So efferent is from the brain, afferent is to the brain. So when you lift your arm or when you move, you're getting a signal from the brain. So it's the efferent nervous system from your brain to the muscles of your body. Now, if you are going from, if you touch something hot and you feel that something is hot, that's the afferent. It's transmitting towards the brain. So efferent from the brain, afferent to the brain. So make sure you remember those two terms. Now, there are the efferent divisions of the peripheral nervous system are two systems. You have the somatic and the autonomic. So the somatic controls skeletal muscles, and the autonomic regulates involuntary smooth and cardiac muscle as well as glands. So we have the sympathetic, which is fight or flight, and parasympathetic includes rest and digit responses. So if we look, there's kind of a breakdown right here on this next slide of what we're going to see. So make sure you remember somatic versus autonomic. Okay, so you have the central nervous system, and you see right here, we see that at the very bottom on the left-hand side, we have somatic sensory receptors and visceral sensory receptors send through the afferent division to the brain and the spinal cord, which sends to the efferent division, either the somatic or autonomic nervous systems. So somatic goes to skeletal muscle, autonomic goes to sympathetic or parasympathetic, and then autonomic, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So make sure you kind of look at this chart and understand the flow of signals throughout the body. So neural tissue, neurons, are the basic unit of the nervous system. They are able to communicate with other cells. And neuroglia supports neurons by regulating their surrounding environment. So see those small little neuroglia cells, they help to regulate the environment. And here is a diagram of a nerve. So you have the cell body, which contains the nucleus, the dendrites, which are the tree-like structures that come off. The dendrites are going to help with communication. You have the axon, which is the whole cord. I know they're only showing a little bit. It's the whole cord-like area that follows from where it says axon to the right and around the curve, and that's where the transmission is going to occur. You see the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is going to be important. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But think of the myelin sheath like the rubber around your iPhone charging cable, okay, or any extension cord or something like that. The myelin sheath helps to make sure the transmission stays clear. You have a node. Nodes are going to come in when we talk about action potential. Neuroglia produces the myelin. Axon terminals. So those axon terminals are going to attach to the dendrites of the next neuron. And we see right here, here's a neuron. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Neurons are cells specialized in transmitting and receiving messages. Dendrites, axons, and cell body. So dendrites receive incoming signals. Axons conduct impulses away from the cell body. And cell body contains the neurons' organelles. So we see right here the dendrites, axon, and cell body. Again, making sure you understand those three parts. Neurons and neuron axons have myelin, right? Are thin pads of a lipid, serves as electrical insulation. Myelinated neurons can transmit electrical signals faster and appear white. So you can see the white there on that nerve. Loss of myelination has issues with signal transduction. So we're going to talk about that at the end when we talk about issues with the nervous system. We'll talk about it here too. Demyelination is a progressive destruction of myelin sheaths caused less loss of sensation and motor control. Example would be multiple sclerosis. Okay, MS is a loss of myelination. So what happens is the signals aren't transmitted as well. So how do neurons send signals? Nerve signals begin with a stimulus, is required before a nerve impulse begins, either from another neuron or from one of the senses. Okay, so the stimulus is what drives from the beginning. How do neurons send signals? They have what's called an action potential. Okay, so nerve signals are electrical impulses sent across the membrane of neurons called action potentials. Electrical impulses are generated by changing amounts of ions inside and outside. So we have potassium, sodium, chlorine, and negative charged proteins. Okay. Now, if we look at here on the next slide, resting neuron potential has a negative potential of about 70 millivolts. All right. This is the result of proteins permanently kept inside the cell. So you see right there, you have the sodium ions and the potassium ions on opposite side. So let's talk about the activation. Depolarization occurs when a stimulus, such as a neurotransmitter, causes a protein channel to open. Sodium ions diffuse inside the cell membrane, creating a positive charge across the membrane. Okay, so it creates a positive charge across the membrane. So you see those blue molecules, those sodium molecules moving in, all right, positively charged sodiums. Now, the next step is repolarization, the return to the original negative charge as potassium ions diffuse out. So now the sodium's diffused in and potassium moves out. So much potassium leaves that the cell, it becomes hyperpolarized or more negative than its original resting state. So now it's more negative than it was before. Now the sodium-potassium ATP pump restores the original concentration of sodium and potassium through active transport. The neuron is now able to conduct another action potential. So what we can see right here in this summary chart is the resting potential is negative 70. At the wave of depolarization, it goes to negative 55. Then at the peak action potential, it's a positive 30. At the repolarization, it's almost to 0. And then the hyperpolarization, it goes too far. And then the sodium-potassium pump at 5 fixes it. Okay, so this is a signal through the body. This is how electrical signals are sent throughout your body through a wave of depolarization and repolarization. Eventually, the signal reaches the synapse. Now, the synapse is the gap between the axon of a neuron and the next one. So what has to be released is a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical messenger. So we've had an electrical message throughout the entire thing. All right, so throughout the neuron, it's an electrical message, but now it has to become a chemical message. So if we see right in this next slide here, all right, we see the synapse are found between muscles, and acetylcholine is released and binds to receptors, and acetylcholine is eventually broken down by an enzyme, ending the process. So a chemical message goes in between the neurons. So you have an electrical message through the neuron, then a chemical message between neurons, and then it becomes an electrical message again throughout the next neuron. Neuron classification. Sensory neurons receive information from peripheral nervous system or special senses. So somatic receptors detect information from the outside world. Visceral receptors monitor conditions within organs such as the lungs or the stomach. Motor neurons carry signals from the central nervous system to muscles or organs. Somatic motor neurons innervate voluntary skeletal muscle. Autonomic motor neurons, okay, that's going to be all involuntary muscles, including the heart and the organs. So remember, skeletal muscle from the last one, skeletal muscle is voluntary, and then cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary. And interneurons join them together. Now, reflexes is a rapid involuntary response to a stimulus. These actions occur quickly because they occur over a reflex arc, a pathway that bypasses the brain. So if you look at this, what's cool is a reflex arc begins with the stimulus of the sensory neurons, such as pain or heat. The sensory neuron is depolarized, and the signal is sent through its axon. And then the signal is processed by an interneuron in the spinal cord, which then activates the motor neuron. So it doesn't actually make it all the way to the brain. It goes through the spinal cord where the interneuron is, which keeps it going. All right? A neurotransmitter is released at the synapse, and the muscle contracts in response. So it's a cool way the reflex bypasses the brain.